All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, in every generation, there are great players who never get the chance to win a championship, and some players never even get the opportunity to get to the finals. Bernard King, Alex English, George Gervin, Dominique Wilkins, they never even got to the finals. And I believe that Chris Paul is going to join their ranks as one of the great all-time players who will never have gotten to an NBA Finals. He's now on the other side of the mountain. At one time, he was probably the best pure point guard in the NBA. As a matter of fact, without a doubt, he was the best pure point guard in the league for about a 4 or 5 year stretch in between the demise of Steve Nash and the rise of Steph Curry. And even the Steph Currys and Dame Lillards and Russell Westbrooks, we would not even really call them pure point guards. We call them more combo guards. But once again, there's no doubt that Chris Paul is on the other side of it. And the only question right now is not even particularly whether or not he's done as a player. It's just a matter of how done is he? Is he well done or is he burnt? Because right now, with the frequency with which he seems to come up with these hamstring injuries, he's never going to be a player that you can count on anymore. He's not even right now a player that you could call the second best player on a championship caliber team. What Chris Paul is somebody who you hope can be healthy in the playoffs. That's all he is. And if he comes up gimpy again, it's something that you have to plan for and expect, which to me officially eliminates the Rockets out of contention as a possible championship contender. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
Chris Paul, we're going to be talking about him because, Chris Paul will have an MRI today to determine just how severe his hamstring injury is. But it's not like there's a version of this where the doctor was going to poke his head from behind the monitor and say, oh, actually, you're totally fine. Off with you then. As Coach Mike D'Antoni put it last night, it's going to be some time just because it's a hamstring. And certainly the Rockets would know. After what happened during last year's playoffs, Chris Paul's hamstring is now firmly entrenched in NBA lore, right?
And hopefully this will assist some of the quote-unquote conspiracy theorists in understanding that no, Chris Paul did not come down with a hamstring injury in Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals because it was quote-unquote rigged or because it was a fix. It's because he's just old. He's old and his body oftentimes is waterlogged because he's taking certain PEDs, allegedly taking certain PEDs so that he can still compete for a championship in the latter part of his career. He has these hamstring injuries because he's an older player. And to be quite frank with you, it also would not surprise me if he's coming down with a multitude of these afflictions because he might have some habits that are assisting him in maintaining a high level of play on an NBA basketball court, and I'll leave it at that.
Right? Somewhere behind Michael Jordan's flu and Willis Reed's torn thigh. They're all in a museum together.
No, not exactly, because Michael Jordan and Willis Reed were able to win. Chris Paul was not. Nobody's going to really care that Chris Paul went down with a hamstring injury in Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals, because I'm not sure that people really think that the Rockets would have won anyway. Of course, their chances would have been higher, but I mean, who knows? We'll leave it at that. The best team won.
What made last night's injury so jarring, though, was how you could actually watch it happen. Here's CP in the second quarter, taking the ball off the court, a little behind the back move, and yeah, there. Goes airborne, grabs the leg, and that's it. Chris would limp off.
And let the record show that's the other hamstring. It's not even the same hamstring. So when I see athletes constantly coming down with those hamstring injuries, that tells me that there's an issue with their conditioning and with their training. Not even so much that they're not in shape. It's not necessarily a flexibility issue. Sometimes it's more a matter of what type of quote-unquote supplements are you taking. Notice that his boy LeBron James also seems to have cramping issues, quote-unquote.
Off the floor, the Rockets, who were flying through the start of this game, going up on Miami by as many as 16, would finish the half only up by 5, and then after what I imagine was a grim scene in the locker room at halftime, they allowed Miami to blow their doors off in the third quarter. And then there was this in the fourth. James Harden taking a hit to the left eye, then staying on the floor for several minutes. He'd play the rest of the way, but he didn't really look quite himself.
Well, at least he earned that foul for a change.
And afterward, he told reporters he was having, quote, a lot of trouble focusing. By the time it was all over, the Rockets had lost the game. They'd lost one of their best players.
At least he had an excuse for why his colors always clashing on his outfits. He could say he can't see them.
They had lost the momentum that they had built up over the last couple weeks. Yes, this injury is coming at the worst possible time for Houston, which had won its previous 5 and seemed to finally be finding its mojo again after a shockingly listless start to the season. Everything will once again now fall on Harden, who has been flat out spectacular lately, but has also shown us...
Well, Harden's probably the best regular season player of this era. And when I say this era, I'm talking about this pull-up for 3, face-up, no hand-check era. He might be the best pure overall regular season player of the last 5 years when we just quantify what he's allowed to do on a basketball court and the numbers that he puts up.
Us over and over.
And I'm not saying that he's the best player. I don't even think that he's a top 5 player in the NBA. But in this era and what he's allowed to do, he probably puts up the best numbers in the regular season of any player in the league overall.
And over again, that if he carries too heavy a load, it will eventually affect him. Last night, he played nearly 43 minutes on the second night of a back-to-back, including the final 32 minutes straight. That cannot be the long-term answer if CP misses significant time, and yet there just aren't a lot of answers for the Rockets, who have had depth issues all season, and the schedule isn't kind from here on out either. Next up is the Spurs, who've won 6 of their last 7, and though, I don't know, it's just the Thunder, Pelicans, Celtics, Grizzlies, Warriors, Blazers, Nuggets, and Bucks up at...
And I told you guys the Spurs are going to be a dark horse. Do not sleep on the Spurs. They seem to be getting it together. They might be on their way back.
Up after that. It's easy to see how the Rockets, who only just this week climbed into a playoff spot, could slip right out again. So far this season, they are 0-5 when CP doesn't play. And that, in turn, would put even more pressure on GM Daryl Morey to do something by the February 7th trade deadline.
Morey is definitely going to try to do something. It would not surprise me if he gets desperate.
Warner is also going to need to grapple with the team's situation with Chris Paul as a whole. The team just signed CP to a 4-year, $160 million contract.
All guaranteed.
Contract that will take him through his 37th birthday. He's missed 31 of his 130 games as a Rocket to injury, including the playoffs, and overall in his career, hamstring injuries have forced him out for extended periods on 5 separate occasions. And look, this time, we are still waiting for those MRI results. We know, hey, maybe this won't be anything. Maybe it won't turn out to be that bad. But if it is, well, you know how everyone around the Rockets likes to say they were just a hamstring away from beating the Warriors in last year's playoffs? This time they could end up a hamstring away from just making the playoffs, as impossible as that may have sounded just a few months ago.
We'll see. As of right now, if you were to ask me, am I willing to bet that the Rockets will make the playoffs? If I were a betting man, yes, I'd bet on them making the playoffs. I think that they're too experienced as a team. They have too much sweat equity, and they have far too high an aspiration to actually be a champion to not at least make the playoffs. They have too many veterans on their squad to not make the playoffs.
Go. Byron, what do you think? How costly is this injury going to be for the Rockets?
Well, I think it's going to be very costly. I think anytime you miss, or lose one of your best players is obviously going to hurt you. But this is, a story that these guys are getting used to. They know that Chris Paul is going to have at some point in time during the season, they're going to have an injury. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for them, last year was his right hamstring. This year is his left hamstring. So hamstrings are so fragile. You're going to have to give him the proper amount of time to make sure he gets this thing completely taken care of.
Hamstrings are rather fragile, and it depends on what the condition that you're working with them is. Are your hamstrings fragile because you're not flexible? Are your hamstrings fragile because you have muscle imbalances? Sometimes people do not train both the anterior and the posterior chain, and their muscles become imbalanced. Is it because you're not hydrated enough? Is it because you're taking certain quote-unquote supplements that are taking away from the strength of your hamstrings or your tendons? Who knows?
And it still might not be enough time.
And then sometimes you're just old. Sometimes players, they just get old. Magic Johnson in the 1989 finals, he had issues with his hamstrings. I think that it was because they'd had so many runs year after year after year after year, and Magic Johnson just got worn down at the wrong time. I also think that he was probably dehydrated.
So they're in a fragile state as an organization. They were rolling basketball-wise, playing really well. Now you lose Chris Paul. James Harden gets hit in the eye. He's going to have to pick up a load again, but he's used to doing it. We know that.
Yeah.
And he loves doing it. James Harden, he's rubbing his hands together right now. He's like, I can average about 35 points per game over the next 2 to 3 weeks with Chris Paul out. But once again, whenever I see certain players who have consistent hamstring issues, I always have to wonder why exactly they're having those issues. As I pointed out, Magic Johnson, even I think Isaiah Thomas had an issue with his hamstring in the '89 finals. But it was not repetitive. So when I see somebody with repetitive hamstring issues, that tells me that either they're not conditioning themselves right, they're not being treated right, or what's causing the hamstring problem is based in something that they're taking into their bodies that they feel like they cannot stop taking.
But it's going to take a toll on him big time.
Exactly.
So it's going to be interesting to see because, like you said, they had just climbed into the playoff picture. We expected this team to be a team that would be fighting Golden State for that best record in the Western Conference and eventually probably play them in the Western Conference Finals. Doesn't look that way. So right now they're going to have to hold the fort, and they got a tough schedule coming.
This is, to me, is about margin for error. The Rockets just do not have a margin for error. They don't have the depth they did before. They got off to a slow start in the season. So now you look at this stretch and say, boy, if they get...
Let me say this, Brian Windhorst. There's one thing smaller than the Rockets' margin for error, and that's their championship window, which is about closed. When we look at their schedule here, the Spurs, the Thunder, the Celtics, Pelicans, the Grizzlies, the Warriors, are they better than any of these teams? Can we look at any one of these 6 teams and say the Rockets are definitely better than these teams? Even the Pelicans, that's a road game. So would you expect the Rockets without Chris Paul to win that game? I wouldn't. If they did, it would be, I wouldn't now call it a surprise. I say that's a pick'em game, but still. They're a team that, they're going to make the playoffs in my view because Chris Paul is going to come back and they have enough veterans on their team with enough high aspirations that they should make the playoffs, but they're no threat in the West.
If they get whitewashed in this stretch, I don't know if they can recover for a while. And then if let's say they limp into the playoffs and get the 6 or 7 seed, now they have a very difficult first round matchup. They just don't have a margin for error. That is a big difference between this year and last year. And then long term, as you mentioned, I've already talked to some executives this year who say Chris Paul is not moving the same.
I said that a long time ago. Chris Paul looks old to me. He looks old and bloated.
And that contract is worrying them. And my retort to them is, well, wait till he's healthy.
Right.
When he's healthy, he's...
Right, but when is that going to be? And how long can he stay there?
Right.
He's still right there at the absolute top of the league. And he's been healthy the last, few games.
So he's looked markedly good
For
the last
sure.
couple weeks.
I think when he's healthy, he's still there. The problem is he's being healthy less and less. And that it's not a character flaw. It's just the reality of the situation.
It's age.
Thank you, sir.
Age and the way he
NBA,
plays, right?
the way he
this
plays.
is the guy, you coached him, the way he goes so hard all the time. There was one...
And also the pace of the game today. Very few teams want to set up in the half-court set. Even the Rockets, they want to run and they want to pass the ball as quickly as possible to the open three-point shooter, or they demand that their better players go one-on-one and beat their man. That's going to put a lot of stress on his body.
One speed for Chris Paul. It's like Russell
he
Westbrook.
doesn't have an off button. Even in practice, when we would practice, he would go 90% in practice until we said, all right, we got a scrimmage. Then it was 110%. That's just the makeup of Chris Paul. That's what you get. So the way he plays, the amount of years that he's played, all those things will accumulate to him getting hurt every single year. And it's just a matter of if you can manage, that amount of time that he's going to miss. If you can manage, as Brian just said, if you can manage to stay right there in the hunt and he can get back healthy, I agree with you, he's still one of the best point guards.
This is why the Warriors are such a historically great team. Because Curry and Durant have had injuries.
Right.
But they've got an MVP in reserve.
Right.
And that's their margin for error is like this. The Rockets' margin for error is like this and getting smaller.
Well, if
that's
the
what's
Rockets trick.
Let me say this. The Warriors' margin for error is not as large as it once was. Because many of these teams across the NBA have caught up with them, not so much when it comes to talent level, but when it comes to style of play. I even made a video about this a while ago where Kevin Durant noted that the other teams in the league have caught up with them. They know their plays. So the difference in the disparity between the Warriors and the other teams is almost purely based on talent level. That's why it's imperative that the Warriors either bring back Durant or be able to execute a sign and trade to move him to the team that he wants to go to and bring back assets that will be able to fill the void that he's left or possibly be able to replace him with Kawhi Leonard. Those are basically their only options if they want to continue to be viewed as a top contender for championships.
This trade watch was already at level 10 before this happens. We're at level 12. I don't know. So this will be a major story for the next month.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. We'll see how the Chris Paul saga goes. So peace.